Hello, dear friends. Thank you so much for joining and watching us today. Today we have philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman, and today's topic is education, the heuristics, and how to master your learning. So today will be a very practical session for you. Please stay very lively, comment, ask questions, and we will answer them in the end. But first of all, let me introduce Stephen Friedman.
Everyone, thank you for joining us. Again, I want to thank the American Consulate in Almaty, Shirin, Tracy, the entire staff of the consulate that have been involved in making these talks possible, including Consul General Eric Meyer. Without their cooperation and facilitation, this would not have happened. So again, I am deeply appreciative to the opportunity and the opportunity to share philosophical perspectives that are capable of clarifying issues that otherwise we can be lost in a maze of confusion about. The point of philosophy is to achieve clarity and to achieve a rigorous clarity. So it's not a matter, as I've emphasized, of opinion or theory or belief. It's not even the level of belief that science demands. Like when we hear like popular discussions of science, of scientific issues, such as climate change, we often hear it expressed in terms of believing in science or believing in the science. That's not what's happening with philosophy. With philosophy, it is not a matter of belief. When philosophy is done well, when its conclusions are well arrived at, well formulated, well achieved, you have no choice. You have to accept them. And that's not to say that you're imprisoned by them. It's saying that they have the power, the incontestable power to basically cut through all of your beliefs, your presumptions, your assumptions, your unwarranted claims, and achieve, again, as I've emphasized, what the religions have aspired to, that truth, but an incontrovertible truth that has the capacity to set you free. There's an aphorism. There are many, again, I write in concentrated philosophical statements. That's not the only form in which I write philosophy, but it's the primary one. And I've probably written to this point maybe 20,000 aphorisms in over 200 books. Well, an aphorism that summarizes what I've just been saying about philosophy and its power. We suffocate under premature senses of reality. Philosophy lets us breathe again. Okay, now tonight what I want to do is, since the general topic is education, I thought I would start by actually quoting something from a play that I wrote and performed originally in New York City about 5 years ago, but also performed 2 years ago when I visited Almaty, Kazakhstan, which is actually the beginning of an answer to a question I was asked at the end of last time: have I been to Kazakhstan? The answer obviously is yes, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that. But first, I'm going to say something about philosophy. I'm going to quote something from the play that I think is going to be shown. The film of the play is going to be shown next week, or that at least I think it was originally scheduled to be shown next week. And then we'll have a session where I discuss it. And then after I introduce tonight with this little quotation from the play, I'll respond to the questions I got at the end of the last session, and then I'll proceed to some general statements, comments about education, and then some more specific practical guidelines for how to master how to master subjects, how to enlarge one's understanding of a subject, one's understanding of the world. Okay, so this play is called Phalaris's Bull, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World. And there's a passage in the play that, well, the first part of the play is mostly autobiographical, but it deals with the development not just of, I don't know, my intellectual interests, my personality, but basically the factors that inclined me towards philosophy. And at some point, I am ready to write philosophy. But before that happens, I have to have learned enough, educated myself well enough in as many different directions as possible. And that's what this little section of the play deals with. And it goes like this. Protagoras, an early Greek philosopher, he said, man is the measure of all things. Also said, to do philosophy, you must know everything. Well, you can't, but you have to try. And to master things, you have to teach. And to teach lots of subjects, you have to tutor, which I did. Hundreds of subjects, from middle school through graduate and professional schools at universities around the world in law, medicine, dentistry, endodontics, aeronautics, business, all the sciences. It was daily mental exercise with benefits, social contact, daily structure, helping people succeed, money. Eventually, I was ready to write philosophy. Now, you'll notice from that a few major themes. First of all, the effort to learn as much as one can and in significant depth. So one doesn't want to be, the English term is dilettante, somebody who has a shallow knowledge, a superficial knowledge, not a deep knowledge or understanding of a subject, knows a little of a lot of things. That's not the kind of understanding that, that kind of understanding can be helpful. All types of understanding, exposure to different perspectives can be helpful. But what's decisively of value is levels of mastery. And that's one of the things I want to talk about tonight, how to achieve that. But notice too, I talk about a convergent relationship to education, to my teaching of different subjects, where it's valuable to me in a lot of different ways. It's valuable not just in terms of an intellectual exercise. I sometimes tell people that when I'm helping people, when I'm teaching people, when I'm tutoring people one-on-one on a daily basis, it's like going to the gym. But instead of working out physically, I'm exercising myself mentally. In addition, I'm approaching the issue of mastery from lots of different directions. Some of the subjects that I mentioned, endodontics, that's root canals, aeronautics, aviation, those are not things that are typically thought of as being related to philosophy, not related to the kind of philosophy that you'll see practiced at a university, but those are the kinds of exposures and understandings that are essential for deep philosophical results. They were indispensable for the type of results that I've been presenting. If I had just followed sort of a narrow academic course and had focused on figures within the history of philosophy and not all of these subjects from all these different directions, I would be, well, the term that we often use or is often used in the academic world is being scholastic. right? You're writing about the subject. You're not so much advancing the subject into new domains. You're not creating results that are broadly of interest or broadly applicable. You're creating results that would be of interest to other members of a philosophy department. It wasn't my goal to achieve those kind of results. I mean, or only those kind of results. It's important that the results that I achieve philosophically have value, have interest, carry weight within that community too, but beyond that. And in any case, broad mastery of lots of subjects is indispensable to philosophy, and it is of value in every possible undertaking. Okay, so that's a little bit of an introduction to what I'm going to return to, but first I want to address the questions that were offered at the end of last session. One of those questions was about decision-making. Let me just, and I think it was decision-making in relation to the advice that others may provide, like going to others for their perspective, on our circumstances, on our situation. Keep in mind, rigorously, philosophically, this, and I think this is actually a coin that I got when I was in Kazakhstan, this is how one decides, rigorously. And one decides rigorously by modes of chance simply because one can't ever evaluate the decision that one makes, right? One can't ever do anything like a controlled experiment to make a decision, then do something that will allow us to rigorously evaluate that decision to see whether that direction or a different direction was the better direction. And we can't do it because if we go in one direction and then veer off in another direction, we're not comparing original circumstances. We're doing one thing and then the other. We need to have done one thing, rewind, and do the other instead. Not a possibility in this world. And especially importantly, and I've made this point before, we don't know when to stop the comparison. Right? What seems like a good decision after a year or two might feel like an awful decision 5 years hence. And we see that in terms of our evaluations of history, of historical events. We see that in the evaluation of American presidents. A president like Harry Truman, who was president right after Franklin Roosevelt at the end of World War II, was not thought of as a great president, at the time, but his historical assessment has elevated. So, history can provide a changing perspective. Our life history provides a changing perspective on the decisions that we made. But I also emphasize that when it comes down to the practical form of deciding, if we're not going to flip a coin, if we're not going to do this purely philosophically, then we go in the direction of the greater convergence, right? Because the non-philosophic space that we see around us, the space of objects, the space is a convergent space. And in a convergent space, the greater convergence represents the more compelling direction. That's how we decide elections, right? The greater convergence is the greater number of votes that a candidate receives. The candidate that receives our vote receives it because the elements that come together, as that candidate is campaigning are more compelling to us than the elements that come together in relation to the other candidate from our perspective. So, what about the perspective of other people on our decision? They're convergent elements. Like we can, for example, survey people. We can ask all of our friends. Maybe, I keep going back to that decision of, selecting a college, but it can be anything, buying a car, what restaurant to go out to. It doesn't matter what the decision. They're all equivalently non-rigorous from a philosophical standpoint, and they're all based on a convergent calculus, convergent decision-making apparatus. Otherwise, well, we can survey our friends, right? And we can find that 19 of our friends recommend a given restaurant or car or vacation destination, and 1 or 2 recommend the opposite. Well, typically go in the direction of the greater convergence. The same thing when we buy a product and we go online, we look for the one that has the greater number of recommendations, the more stars, the higher the rating. It's a way of identifying the stronger convergence as it presents itself. That is not to say that the result will be the more satisfying in the end for us. We can't know that, and we can't compare with the alternative. It reminds me of times in the past where I've gone to restaurants, when we were still going to restaurants, right, before the pandemic. There were times when I would have friends who would like to eat out, and would often like to eat out at expensive restaurants with strong reputations. And I would go, with these restaurants, and again, the reputation becomes a convergent element, inclining us in that direction. Go in the direction of the greater reputation, that's a stronger convergent element. Well, looking back, the best meals I've ever had were not at those restaurants. We're not at the restaurants with the reputations, not at the restaurants that were the more expensive. I've mentioned in previous talks a cousin of mine, a physician, who always had very interesting things to say. I mentioned once having a conversation about Van Gogh with him, where I was talking about how Van Gogh's art didn't save him from depression or despair, maybe suicide. And my cousin's comment to that was, Van Gogh's art didn't fail Van Gogh. The people around Van Gogh failed Van Gogh. Now, whether you accept that or not, it's a valuable insight comment. Well, this cousin liked to go to restaurants, and there was a period of time when every week I would go with him to a restaurant. They were never well-known restaurants, never expensive restaurants, never restaurants with some glowing reputation. They were restaurants that he happened to eat in sometime and several times, where the food, a particular dish, was particularly good, particularly striking. That's been my experience also. So you can use a lot of decision-making apparatus. You can go to friends, you can get recommendations, you can read up. It's just a means of achieving a sense of a greater convergence that will go in the direction of, but in the end, you can't compare it to the alternative. And not only is there no guarantee that the result will be the better decision, but there's no way ever of evaluating it, okay? I think that question also had a reference to bucket lists, like the idea of having a set of destinations, activities, places that we might want to visit or things we might want to do, skydiving, seeing the Taj Mahal, walking the Great Wall of China, whatever those experiences might be, as again, something that we would choose to do if given, a choice between going to something on our bucket list and going down the street. We'd choose something on the bucket list, and we would make those choices on the bucket list, partly according to reputation, partly based on our personality, what we knew about each of those bucket list activities, goals that we listed for ourselves. Again, I mean, I've visited the pyramids. I visited places that I had long wanted to visit. One of the things that often happens is that you've spent so much time in advance of the actual encounter, the actual experience, like studying it, reading about it, that when you actually encounter it in person, it doesn't have the impact that something that's being experienced for the first time without any anticipation, because you didn't know what was going to come, might have. There's an American philosopher, actually from California, from the 1960s. His name is Eric Hoffer. He was a political philosopher. He actually also wrote somewhat aphoristically, not quite as concentratedly as I tend to write, but he would write in kind of short paragraphs, mostly a little bit like Pascal, the French philosopher, of the 17th century. Eric Hoffer, towards the end of his life, wrote this book, Before the Sabbath. And it's one of my favorite books. When I was asked the other week to list my favorite book, I mentioned Andre Malraux's Anti-Memoirs, but at some point I would have listed Eric Hoffer's Before the Sabbath, before I read Malraux. Well, Eric Hoffer talks about how the genuinely creative don't go to a sunset so much. They don't go to things that have a reputation for greatness. They want to take something that's otherwise insignificant and make it great. Another way of saying it is they want to see or experience the magic, the greatness in something that often goes unappreciated or underappreciated. Van Gogh learned to paint partly by going to the Louvre and copying paintings, as most 19th century artists aspired to an artistic career did. But Van Gogh's paintings were not of paintings in the Louvre. Van Gogh's paintings were of old shoes, of a bedroom, of ordinary objects that he was able to elevate. So it's a matter of learning to see. That's part of what education actually is most importantly trying to achieve. Our ability to see, to appreciate what might be in front of our eyes that ordinarily goes unnoticed, unappreciated, underappreciated. So again, we can make a bucket list, but what's likely to be as striking, as memorable, as impactful in our lives, once we have trained ourselves to see and to experience, it's likely to be something right in front of our eyes. Some of the most haunting images in the history of art are in the paintings, the interiors of Vermeer, the 17th century Dutch painter, whom Picasso said he would have traded all of Italian painting for a single Vermeer. Okay? Well, what's most haunting in a Vermeer is how he painted a wall, the walls in Vermeer. And to me also, there's as much mystery and beauty and power in a wall as there is in the Grand Canyon or the Taj Mahal, as much mystery. And that's why a wall can become the inspiration for some of the greatest artistic results ever achieved in the work of Vermeer. Okay, so, but again, coin. It frees you from a lot of your presumptions about what is seemingly deciding the decision-making process rationally, but it's not rational. It's an arbitrary process because, again, we can't do the comparisons to know. Okay, good. Second question was about depression and loss of pleasure, okay, anhedonia. For me, now we had a week on mental health, and I gave some practical guidelines for dealing with mental health issues like depression. I'll restate a few of those, but for me, ultimately, depression is intimately connected to despair. Tendency to give up, to feel that there's no way out or no good way forward, no better way forward, no hope. One of the things that philosophical rigor most directly attacks is just that mode of thinking, or just the thinking that underlies that. I think it's in Dostoyevsky's Notes from the Underground, where, if it's not in that particular book by Dostoyevsky, it's in Dostoyevsky, where he comments that one of the most effective ways to drive a person mad is to give them a simple, repetitive task to perform over and over and over. Okay, right? That relates to that definition of insanity, right? Definition of insanity is doing the same thing repeatedly, expecting a different result. There's something in repetition, right, that we struggle with. Well, one response to that is there's no real repetition. There's an incident. I like to refer to the philosopher Wittgenstein, right? I think I've mentioned that he's been the most important influence upon my work. Turns out that there are certain similarities I discovered in his personality and certain orientations to experience. A lot of his favorite writers happen to be mine, so I feel a kinship, with Wittgenstein. Well, Wittgenstein had a friend, a student, Norman Malcolm, who ended up becoming a professor of philosophy at Cornell. But he studied under Wittgenstein at Cambridge. This was in the years leading up to World War II. Well, at some point, World War II broke out, and Norman Malcolm, an American, was drafted into the service. I think he entered the Navy. And he maintained a correspondence with Wittgenstein, who was older at this point and not fighting in the war. And Norman Malcolm was complaining about what a boredom the war was. And you hear this a lot, that, just like airline pilots say that airline, piloting is endless hours of boredom punctuated by a few minutes of abject horror, abject terror, right? Most of the time, it's uneventful. Well, most of warfare, and you see this in a lot of the great literary works on war. You see it in the American writer Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage. A lot of war, boring, okay? But Wittgenstein's response to Norman Malcolm's complaining about that is the philosophical response you might expect. If you paid more attention, you would not find it so boring. It's a matter of paying sufficient attention to what's in front of our eyes. And that's when we get mired in a state of depression and hopelessness, where we're not seeing the world, we're not seeing the possibilities, we're not seeing things changing in front of our eyes. We're seeing a sameness, We become trapped in a repetition that's not repetitive of the world, but repetitive of our seeing of the world. It's this issue of not seeing the world, not seeing the possibilities, not seeing things as they are changing, as they are evolving. And so always offering us a way out of our despair is something that goes back to our childhood. If you look at children's drawings, children are not drawing what's in front of their eyes. If a child draws a person, he or she is basically drawing a stick figure. It's drawing a circle for the head, and it's drawing a line for the body, and it's like lines coming out for arms and legs. The child is not drawing a person, and he's not drawing what he's seeing in front of his eyes as a person. He's drawing his concept of what he's seeing. When we are struggling, we are often not seeing the world, but seeing our concept of the world. We are seeing an approximation to the world. We're seeing something less than the world itself. Have to learn to see better. There's a film, actually, that this relates to. Its title is Michael. It was a film from the 1990s, an American film. It starred John Travolta as the Archangel Michael, one of the principal angels that comes down to Earth periodically. It turns out he's come down for his last visit to help struggling humanity, struggling individuals. It's a very particular type of mission that he undertakes. In the same way that, like, tutoring, is like a particular, engagement with a student. Well, Michael in this film is coming down to Earth to help a few particular individuals with their struggles in life. And what he's constantly telling people, what he's constantly explaining to them is as how he's able to sort of see the things that he's seeing and achieve the results that he's intent upon achieving is by paying sufficient attention. And that the people around him, the human beings around him, are not paying such attention. I've said that one of the values of rigor is to free us from the past, right? The past can't guarantee the future. The next moment, the moment after that, can be radically different from what came before. We don't expect it to be. We don't presume it to be. We suffer our expectations. We suffer our presumptions. It's even at the level of mortality, disease, old age, death. I've often referred to Socrates and the beginning of Western philosophy. And so we go our separate ways, you to live and I to die, and which is better, only God knows. Well, when someone dies, and I've mentioned this before, this is one of my aphorisms, what do you know? That they will not return to the end of all time? And how exactly do you know that? You don't, but you live in terms of it. You breathe it, and you suffer it. That's partly what I mean in that aphorism. We suffocate under premature senses of reality. We think we know the direction of events. We think we know the direction of the world. We're generalizing from the past. Philosophy lets us breathe again, frees us from those expectations. We can never rigorously justify despair. Circumstances are always different. even if we find ourselves doing the same thing, we will not necessarily get the same result. That's the principle, as I mentioned, of the battering ram. When we are using a battering ram to try to break down a door, we're doing the same thing, but eventually the door collapses. Because every time we apply the battering ram to the door, it's being applied against a different background, against the background, the history of having done it one more time than the preceding time. And at some point, that can make all the difference. Now, in terms of practical issues, with depression, I've mentioned things like maintaining an orderly environment, getting up in the morning, making your bed, forcing yourself to go outside. One of the most depressive of circumstances is confinement, voluntary or otherwise. Lots of studies have been done that going outside and experiencing natural greenery, green grasses, trees, even blue sky, but especially green, seems to elevate the human mood. Walks, they're indispensable for my mental well-being. Always remembering that doing the same thing over and over again is not possible. It can't be done exactly. And at some point, we may have the decisive breakthrough, as long as we don't stop. But even if we stop, at some point, we might get a thought from a different direction. We might get inspired in a way. The silences, can be invigorating over time. It's something that Mozart liked to emphasize, that he said, in music, the most important component are the silences. Well, we talk about the silence of God. When we meditate, it's often done silently. I get ideas in the shower. There's the noise of the shower, but I lose a sense of that. I lose a sense of the surrounding environment when I'm outside walking. So we want to be receptive. The point is that we're never justified in giving up hope, because all of our circumstances, moment to moment, are always changing. We're just not paying sufficient attention to the changes. And so we get trapped, not in a repetitive cycle that's the reality, but in a repetitive cycle that's our sense of the reality. And our sense of the reality falls short of that reality. Okay, so some comments on depression in general. Again, the most important aspect in dealing with it is to recognize that the rigor of our circumstance, and that moment to moment, day to day, the possibilities for change are always present. There's the final line of Thoreau's Walden. I've talked about Walden before, the 19th century American philosopher. The sun is but a morning star. No matter how dark you may feel, it is at the moment. And then there's that famous comment, I think it's attributed to Winston Churchill. I think he said this, but that's who I've heard it attributed to, Winston Churchill, that when you walk through the shadow of the valley of death, keep walking. At some point, things will change. Okay. Now, I was asked about Kazakhstan, and yes, I visited Kazakhstan one time, 2 years ago. It was actually at the invitation of Consul General Eric Meyer, who's been a friend of mine for many years. He just entered his assignment as Consul General, and I visited soon after. So we kind of experienced, or I experienced Almaty for the first time. He was still relatively new to the environment. I did not experience it. It's not in general my interest in exploring an environment as a tourist might. I'm not fundamentally a tourist, and we'll get to that issue in terms of mastery as well in a second. We went to the opera house several times for an opera, a ballet, concert recital. I gave some talks. I led some discussions actually at the American Space in Almaty. That was how I met Tracy, and that is really where these sort of talks ultimately had their genesis. I was actually scheduled to come back to Kazakhstan in April before COVID interrupted those plans. I would have stayed longer, given some talks, some performances. One of the things I did do when I was here was to perform the play, again, that we're going to show the film of, Phalaris's Bull. I performed it at a theater in Almaty, and the reception was as warm and as enthusiastic as any reception the play has received. So my experiences have been uniformly positive. And just to give you a specific example, I was invited to the home of a consular employee, a Kazakh employee, who invited me to meet his family, his wife. She prepared as lavish a feast as I've ever been served. It was basically an introduction to Kazakh cuisine. It had a whole series of traditional dishes, meats and breads, and it filled this long table. And what I saw in evidence was the fundamental principle of hospitality. Don't ask, give, right? If you go to somebody's house, they ask you, would you like this, would you like that? The polite reaction often is, no, I'm fine. So rather than put somebody in that slightly uncomfortable position, give them. Instead of asking them, would you like a glass of water, give them a glass of water. If they don't want it, they don't have to drink it. But just give. Don't put them in the awkward position of feeling that they're imposing, okay? That's what I felt, in that Kazakh home. And one of the most remarkable things in the course of the conversation was I was saying how much I was enjoying, my time in Almaty. And the father said to me, stay. You're welcome to stay. You're welcome to stay with us. You're welcome to stay with us here for as long as you would like in our home. So that is a fundamental principle of Kazakh hospitality. We invite a guest into our house. That guest is entitled to stay for as long as he or she would choose. Well, there. So that's as remarkable a display of human responsiveness and again, fundamental hospitality as you will see anywhere in any culture. So yes, so I've been to Kazakhstan. I hope to return. I would have returned already if it hadn't been again for the pandemic. And I hope that soon, maybe with the emergence of vaccines that are looking like they may be effective, and and safe. Well, we still need to see, right? The data is still being evaluated. It's still a little early, but one of the hopes is that such a vaccine may emerge soon, become available soon, and I'll be able to return sooner rather than later. So there's a little bit about my Kazakhstan experience. So yes, I've been to Kazakhstan, and it was a remarkable experience for me. Okay, now, in terms of issues of education, I've kind of already hinted at the fact that we're dealing with kind of convergent processes when we are trying to achieve any goal, even an educational goal, right? The goal of becoming well-educated is a goal of, like I was saying in terms of that early quotation, achieving an acquaintance with, and we hope a mastery of, as many disciplines as we possibly can. Now, that's not, no, we're not going to be a master of everything, but one of the keys to having a fruitful encounter with a subject is to take that encounter, no matter what level we undertake it at, as seriously as possible. To do it, and this will sound maybe a little bit funny, but almost to undertake it like we might an actor learning a role. I mean, we've seen how like Hollywood actors might prepare for a role if they're really committed actors, right? Where if the role involves horseback riding and they don't know how to horseback ride, they might spend 3 months learning. Or if the role involves fencing, they might spend 6 months learning how to fence, right? They're taking their job that seriously, so they're not going to become an Olympic fencer, but they're going to achieve a level of mastery that will give them special insight into that activity that then they can use elsewhere and apply elsewhere. It's something I've seen, I've encountered as an example in a number of instances. Like here's one. I mentioned, that I tutor people. Most of my teaching is one-on-one. Some years ago, I did a lot of that type of teaching, one-on-one tutoring, with actors, especially like actors who were in like weekly television shows where they couldn't go to a normal school, and so they needed to be schooled on the set, at the studio where they were filming. And these were teenagers, maybe 16, 17, they were in high school here, but they had successful careers. They were famous. In some instances, they had their own weekly show. Okay? And I would often get the question, I'm a successful actor, I'm a successful actress. Why do I need to study geometry? And my answer always was, well, yes, you're a successful actor. You've mastered, that activity at a level that is beyond what most people will achieve. If you are able to master geometry at some level, maybe not a comparable level, but at some level, you might be able to see a connection, make a connection between those activities, between geometry and acting that no one's ever seen before, no one's ever made before, because no one's ever had the mastery of one and the expertise of the other. That's one of the things that mastery, or the pursuit of mastery, allows us to undertake. That kind of convergence to achieve convergent results. Now, these convergent results can be in terms of just our own satisfaction, intellectual satisfaction, but they can often take the form of creative results. Most creative results in the history of humanity are from bringing together things that had not previously been brought together understandings of subjects that had not previously been exhibited by a single person before, to the degree that now allows for a new synthesis, a new result, a new convergence. We see that all the time in every discipline. We see that in music, where a given type of music will be the fusion of rockabilly and hip hop, or different musical genres are. I mean, usually a new musical act is introduced or characterized by being a fusion of a variety of previously separate musical genres or musical traditions. That's how creative advance typically occurs. But it's only going to occur if there's some level of mastery of those individual components. The greater the level of mastery, the greater the possible fusion, and the more we will get out of that result. How do we achieve that mastery? Well, for one thing, don't go into the activity, don't study geometry as if you're an actor doing it just because you need to pass an exam or get a high school diploma, or get something that's almost artificial. Do it as if, and what I recommend is, and what I always did, do it as if that will be your life pursuit. Do it as if, do geometry as if you were a geometer, or as if you were going to be one, or as if you were aspiring to be one. It's a kind of acting, right? To put yourself in that role. But it's one of the most effective paths to the kind of mastery that sustains our interest in the subject, because in general, when you have a superficial relationship to something, you're not going to be rewarded very much from it. You're not going to gain that much insight from it. But the more deeply you explore, the more it's going to potentially reward you. So the more you can, now I've mentioned repeatedly that it's the nature of our circumstance, right? Our existential circumstance, that we can't leave the world, come back inside someone else's body, see it from their perspective, right? And it's our thinking is such that we can. Like when we read a novel in the third person, it's as if we're seeing the world from outside the world and we're seeing these characters moving about. But we can't really do that. And the fact that we can't really do that is the basis for our not being able rigorously, legitimately to judge, right? Because we can't know another person's circumstances well enough. It can be argued God can't know our circumstances well enough. God cannot quite forget that he's God, even if he put himself in our mind for an instant. It's not the same as being us, which means it's not, even God is not in a position to judge rigorously as we understand the absolute limit of rigor, and it's only the absolute limit that matters, that frees us. Okay? So, but as an exercise, as a path to mastery, yes, we want to try to enter the perspective of the person whose life pursuit has been geometry. If we're studying Buddhism, we want to try to sort of enter that perspective, see the world from inside Buddhism, see the world, see nirvana, see enlightenment, see what Siddhartha Gautama might have seen, or what we might imagine him to have seen under the Bodhi tree at that moment of enlightenment. We want to try. When I went through a period when I was reading novels like Great Expectations, the a great novel by Charles Dickens, the 19th century English novelist. And as I was reading it, I would try to put myself in the worldview of each character as that character was speaking. Now, it took a very long time to read the book, in that way. But for one thing, it was an enormously effective intellectual exercise. For another thing, it did provide me with additional insights into experience that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise by trying to take that person's perspective seriously enough to briefly make it my own. Not to make it my own to the point where I'm going to be able to judge, because I can't make it my own to that degree. We forget sometimes that we can't do that. But to make it my own enough to learn more from it than I otherwise would. Okay? So when I was studying different philosophers, it was important for me not to stand back and criticize their work, but to first get inside it and to try to see the world from inside their philosophical perspectives. I did that with the major religious traditions when I studied Confucianism or Taoism or the work of Zhuangzi. It was a matter of trying to see the world, at least briefly, momentarily, from inside that perspective. And what was the test of the success of that? Well, again, it's not a rigorous undertaking. It's a heuristic undertaking. It can give us, it can help us understand. It can help us achieve the kind of salvation that rigor, is ultimately achieving. That's a matter of distinction, not a matter of the similarities that I'm discussing here achieving. But for me, often the test of some degree of success was an emotional response. Laughter or tears or some chills, something strongly emotional. I mean, it's been said that laughter precedes enlightenment because it's an emotional experience. Well, when I have those kinds of emotional experiences in response to something, that gives me a sense that I'm achieving a degree of insight that will now make that experience, that understanding, useful, something that I can sort of use for additional perspective. Okay? That at that point, I feel like I'm in a position to evaluate it, not again from the standpoint of someone in that tradition, and not to criticize, but to make a decision as to whether that's a direction that I want to go more in, that I want to embrace more fully. But it's also actually a test when I'm doing art. A lot of my art now is abstract, and I'm often asked, how do you know that a work of art is done? And I said, it's very simple. I have to get chills. I have to get tears. If I don't have that degree of an emotional response, the work of art isn't done. And I might think it's done, but if I haven't gotten the emotional reaction, I will not stop working. And at some point, I will get that emotional response. I will look at what I've done and I'll see, yes, it hadn't been done previously, but now it is. So the same kind of thing, applies, to our encounter with subjects. We want to be moved intellectually to some degree to get a sense of, added understanding, to get ideas that we would not have had previously, but to be moved emotionally, by the subject, by the beauty of the subject. And it's one of the things that you see in people that are, deeply involved in a given subject, intellectual pursuit. Somebody like Einstein was always talking about the beauty of his results. when the theory of relativity was being tested, and he didn't know, whether it was going to pass some of these experimental tests, of its validity. He said, well, if it turns out not to have been true, if the experiments don't validate it, at least it was a beautiful theory. So there is that, we want to kind of try to achieve, that sort of relationship to our subjects. Now, there's something else too, it's even further in that direction. I think I mentioned that my philosophical work, religions like Buddhism, Christianity, start from the worst, right? Christianity in particular addresses the issue of torture to death. Buddhism starts from the recognition of the reality of disease, old age, death. One of the first things I did was a film, Torture, to deal with the issue of extreme suffering. And I've mentioned in the past that when I was beginning to write philosophy, I would try to project myself into a circumstance of being buried alive, being burned, over 95% of my body, third-degree burns, being adrift in space, adrift, to my death. And once I imagined myself in these extreme circumstances, I would then say, okay, now, write philosophy. Write something that can rise to that occasion. Okay. Well, there's the current work that I've been developing is convergence theory. I've referred to that a lot. That's the non-rigorous sort of offshoot of philosophy. There's philosophical rigor when you sort of remove the rigor. Everything else is convergence. Okay, science, everything could be understood in terms of convergent sort of processes. And over the last 5 years or so, I've been writing mostly in aphoristic form. The book is now, I don't even know, maybe a couple of thousand aphorisms long. But it began with something a little bit unexpected. It began with a reference to an incident involving a comedian, an American comedian. His name was Artie Lang, a comedian with issues. Mental health issues, we'd say. A lot of comedians seem to struggle, with, if it's not mental health, it's with the circumstances, of life. He actually had a drug problem, and maybe because of that, or that probably exacerbated it, one night he was suicidal. And he ended up actually attempting suicide. Not successfully, but attempting suicide. And he wrote about that experience. Now, it happened in New York City. He was and he's a successful, performer. Happened in a high-rise in New York. He was in an upper story of the building. And it was, dawn was coming. The sky was brightening. He could see the water around Manhattan. He could see the city. He could see the shimmering waters. And it was awesome in its beauty. And he noted that. And he said, but it did not save me. That is ultimately what we are searching for, what we want, even in our educational pursuits. We are motivated, I am motivated, by that knowledge, that understanding that will have the power not just to sort of intrigue us or interest us, but to save us. It's the same thing that motivates a composer like Beethoven to write piece after piece after piece, masterpiece after masterpiece. You can say, well, he's already written 100 masterpieces. What is the next one going to do? How's that? Well, he's writing the next one because the previous ones didn't achieve the final consummation, didn't bring everything to a complete consummation, didn't end it all in some complete convergent result. So it's like there is in education, in creative work, in our general pursuits of knowledge, of understanding, the interest in achieving that level of result that is completely transformative. Every time Leonard Bernstein, a famous conductor, composer, American conductor, composer of the 20th century, would conduct a work by Beethoven, a work by Mahler, he was aiming within that performance to achieve a kind of salvation. That's the level of commitment that can drive us and that can produce the most significant intellectual and educational rewards, that we're looking for that which can be that degree of transformative in our lives and in our understanding. Okay. I see Shirin has appeared, so I think we should.
We are very excited about these talks, and our visitors, our viewers also are very interested, and they have a lot of questions. So we will leave some time to answer them. Well, the first question is from our Ansar, who is asking, all philosophers write their books on the paper. I guess it's the best way to control your thoughts amidst the routine life. Can writing your thoughts, problems, ideas help figure out what ideas are?
You know, there are different philosophers have different approaches, to the actual writing of philosophy. My relation, and I should speak primarily about myself because that's what I can speak about most intimately, right, with the greatest authority. When I first started writing philosophy years ago now, I would sit down and, like I mentioned earlier, put myself in a certain state of mind. Often, once it was obvious to me that philosophy had the power to address extreme human circumstances, extreme degrees of suffering, I wanted to make sure that what I was writing was rising to that level of response. So I would, like I mentioned, imagine myself, try to project myself into those circumstances in the same way that I mentioned when I tried to undertake to master a subject like geometry or physics. I would do it from the standpoint of projecting myself into the position of somebody who made a career of that subject. So I would do it almost like an actor. I would imagine myself, again, in a coma, but unable to move, but aware. So I was trapped in my body. And my philosophical work had to rise to the demand of that extreme circumstance. Okay? And in that case, writing out the results could help me refine the ideas, the sequence of ideas. But over time, my approach to writing philosophy changed and I think deepened, so that it was something that was happening. And this is true for a lot of writers, of philosophy, a lot of mathematicians. Einstein is in this category, Poincaré, similar. There's a long list where the most important creative work is happening subconsciously or unconsciously. It's like I am not literally thinking through the thoughts, like in some, as I might be reading through lines in a text. And I'll tell you a situation where that was the case, but philosophically, at some point after maybe 10 years of writing philosophy, it became a much more automatic process where I would go about my business. I mean, I would maybe be in a semi-trance state. I would watch television, but not really watch television. It would be on, and I would respond to maybe some of the images, fragments of dialogue. So I was in like kind of a semi, I'd be walking and aware a little bit of my surroundings, but not fully, not completely. And then I might be lying down in bed, and then all of a sudden, aphorisms would come. And they would come fully formed. And they were more precisely formed than I could have achieved by thinking to those aphorisms or thinking through them. And when that process first revealed itself to me, first became my method of writing philosophy, I wouldn't always rush to write things down. I wasn't, I wasn't fully aware of what was happening. And I found that I might get an aphorism at night and think, oh, okay, I like that. I'll write it down in the morning. In the morning, I might forget one word of the aphorism, and not a major word. It might have been like a preposition, of or by or for. Forget exactly what preposition was there, and the aphorism wasn't there anymore. So I realized that these things were coming to me fully formed and precisely formed and had to be written down as they emerged. It would often take the form of, there was a period where I wrote a lot of aphoristic books that were short, like 10, 20, 30 aphorisms that became, well, I'll talk more about them, but they were poetically constructed, highly concentrated, and self-contained, but they would come all at once, like one aphorism after another, after another, after another, after another, after another, after another, 10 of them or 20 of them or 30 of them or 40 of them until the book was done, okay? And sometimes they would come right before I would go to bed. I would not be able to go to bed for the next hour. I would write one down, turn the light on, write it down, make sure I could write it down clearly enough, because sometimes when I first started this, I'd scribble it and wouldn't be able to read it in the morning, and it was lost, okay? So I'd write it down really carefully, usually in big letters, so I could make sure to read what I had written. Turn off the light, because I didn't know there was going to be another aphorism coming. A minute later, another one comes, light back on, write it down, turn the light off. That process would continue maybe for an hour, maybe for an hour and a half, until the book was there. That became the only method of writing philosophy that I trust, because all of the elements are convergent within those aphorisms. The sound is there. A given aphorism might concentrate hours of thought. I've mentioned, I don't think during these talks, but let's say I have 20,000 aphorisms, let's say. That's probably a reasonable estimate. The reason I write aphoristically is because to fully explain each of those aphorisms in prose, in extended prose, might take maybe 3 pages each, maybe 4 pages, something like that. In some cases, as much as 10 pages. Well, that's more philosophy. 200,000 pages of philosophy is more philosophy than any human being has ever written. That's more philosophy than I could ever imagine. So I'm partly writing in that concentrated form because there's so much content that I'm trying to get down on paper. But again, I am not going in search of the aphorism now. It's coming to me, and it's coming fully formed. But that's only because of how much thought I've otherwise been doing. So like much of my life has been devoted to thinking. And so, so the process has reached a level of, I guess, refinement is a way to say it, where it doesn't take any conscious or intellectual effort on my part, but the effort has been there like over many years. But
yes, interesting how our brain works in a diffused mode.
yes.
So like we are not thinking about and the ideas just appear.
And those are the only ideas I really trust. And again, lots of people have been, have worked in that same way. They only trust what comes to them, not what they go in search of. Because when you go in search of something, you're often forcing results. When they come to me, they have an inner life that will hold up. And one of the things that often happens too is that the aphorism that comes to me will be a little bit beyond my sort of conscious understanding. I may not fully understand it, when it first appears, but then a day later or a week later or a year later, I'll look back at it and say, yes, now I understand why this took the form it did. But that's another thing that I like. I like when I'm doing art, I like my next work to be a little bit beyond what I'd done previously in all of my art. Well, the same thing when writing philosophy. I like each thought to be a little bit beyond what I'm fully capable of grasping.
That's great. And we have another great question, like the continuation from Haidar Shah. He asks, what moved you in learning philosophy? Like, what
Okay.
moved you
Now, this is an excellent question. All of these questions are excellent, by the way. I don't always say that they're excellent, but trust me, I appreciate all the questions. Okay, let me say this, that that film that I mentioned, Phalaris's Bull, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World, that is on Amazon Prime. I don't know where in the world one has access, if one has access everywhere to Amazon Prime, but it's free on Amazon Prime if you're a member. It is going to be shown, I think, next week, as part of these talks. That deals with that question. That is an autobiographical film based on a play. It's actually a film of the play that deals specifically with the development of my interest in philosophy, what drove it. And I can give you a few kind of basic points. First of all, what drove it is what has driven a lot of religious individuals, namely a fundamental sense of dissatisfaction with circumstances. Like I mentioned in the film that the earliest memories I have are nightmares. Okay, so the world presented itself as a problem, to be addressed. Like Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, when he was confronted, he was not a philosopher or a religious figure until he encountered, according to legend, disease, old age, and death. And then the problem of those motivated his philosophical work. That's true for me too, in the sense that it was the unsatisfactoriness of various aspects of experience, like certain loss, the loss of my grandfather. Like his death was the first death that I really closely experienced. That was a transforming experience for me. But there was a specific moment early on, like when I was, and again, I was young, and I talk about it a little bit in the play, but I was reading, my parents always bought me books or allowed me to buy books and allowed me to subscribe to book clubs, science book clubs, and I did so from a young age. Like from about the age of 7 or so, there was like a Time Life series of books that was was a science series that I was reading. So I was interested in science from a very young age, interested in mathematics from a young age, and as I kind of encountered, and this relates to actually tonight's topic, I went into a library when I was, when I was about 10. I went into a library, and just out of curiosity, I pulled a physics textbook off the shelf of the library. It was, I don't know if it was a high school physics textbook or a college physics textbook, whatever it was way beyond my level, right, as a 10-year-old. Okay, but I took it home, and I talk about it a little bit in the play. I spent the first night reading the first paragraph and couldn't understand it. But I persisted. And each day I read a little more, and each day it became a little more clear and a little more clear. Then the following year, my parents bought me a set of Encyclopedia Britannica, which was at that time like one of the main reference libraries in the world. And I read a lot of that, and that had a lot of sophisticated articles, but mainly in the sciences. By the time I was 12 or so, I was reading a lot of physics, and I was reading books on relativity theory. Like there was a book by just a lot of like physics and science. And one day I went into a bookstore. So again, I'm 12 at this point, and I pick a book off the shelf the author was Alfred North Whitehead. I didn't know who he was. It turned out he was a philosopher and a mathematician. The title of the book was Science and the Modern World. And I thought, okay, I'm interested in science. I bought the book, okay? And it turned out at that time, I was taking some summer classes at Caltech, that university, that science university, in Los Angeles. And I would take the bus back and forth. It was safe in those days, and it was a long bus ride. It maybe took, I don't know, an hour or more each way. And so on that bus, I read this book, Science and the Modern World, which I thought was science. It was not science. It was philosophy, and it was very difficult philosophy. That was my introduction to the subject. Now, it turns out that having been introduced to it at that level by such an eminent author completely captivated me. It also, I guess because I had been reading a lot of science, my brain was trained enough, and I'd been reading the Britannica, my brain was trained enough that I could understand it well enough that as I continued to read it, the experience of reading such a difficult book, and this actually applies to tonight's topic too, the experience of reading such a difficult book at such a young age meant that from that point forward, philosophy was a relatively easy subject for me. That experience of reading that book at that age was harder than anything I read or had to do philosophically in the philosophy department at Harvard. So one of my recommendations to you in general is start hard. Start with difficult things. You don't have to understand them. You don't have to understand all of them. I've mentioned, I think, a number of times that not everybody understands all of Shakespeare. Even the great commentators on Shakespeare, like Samuel Johnson, didn't understand all of Shakespeare. That's not a reason not to expose yourself. And if you can expose yourself to difficult things at a young age, that can make everything else easy. It also turns out that having these kinds of educational experiences at a young age, I just read a study, is one of the best things that you can do, or that people can do, to help prevent the development of Alzheimer's and other dementias. So, like, if, for yourself, study hard, study young. For your children, if and when you have children, let them study young and hard. You don't have to understand, but it can elevate, your ability to understand.
It's like kind of accepting the challenge.
Yes.
The challenge.
But again, in terms of that question, the play deals with just that issue, because it's meant to be a combination of my philosophical results, but in the context of the circumstances of my life that motivated my interest and my ongoing pursuit of philosophy. But that moment of reading that book by Alfred North Whitehead in the bus back and forth to Caltech was where it actually began.
Yes, and we come to the next question. Let's answer them very briefly. So we are unfortunately again running out of time, but we still have some questions. So answer our comments, like some people say, focus on the, oh, no, that's wrong, sorry. Oops, I lost the question. Yeah, the question is like, why is philosophy underestimated in the world?
Yes, another excellent question. For one thing, philosophers and professors of philosophy have not done a good job of representing it, of explaining what it is, of developing it, of using it. When I think I might have met, I don't mean this to be self-serving, but I will tell you more about this incident some later date. But at one point I went back to I went back to Harvard to present my philosophical results to the philosophy department after I graduated, and I developed my results to a point where they merited discussion. Okay, it was a fascinating interaction but there wasn't a lot of understanding on the part of the faculty. There was actually a lot of like almost horror. Again, I'll go into that details, but a few years later, I had an art show in Los Angeles, and on the wall, in the center of the gallery, there was my visual art, like similar to like the art you see behind me. And on the walls were the aphorisms of one of my books. There were maybe 55 aphorisms, the contents of one of these books. And a woman who was from the Smithsonian, she worked at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., came into the museum. I got a call about this. Turns out she had been at she'd been at Harvard, and she had taken philosophy courses with the professors at Harvard. And this was like the most eminent department in the world at the time. And she read the contents of my work on the wall, and she said that, and I told her that I had gone back to Harvard and it didn't go well. You know, they didn't seem to, I don't know, it just didn't seem to go well. And her response was, yeah, because it seems that your work has kind of distilled things to a point beyond. There's a lot of confusion even about what philosophy is. Like I mentioned a few weeks ago about Heidegger, that the reason Heidegger is confusing is he's confused himself. It's not easy to achieve philosophical clarity. And the degree of clarity that I may have achieved in some of my results is simply because of how many people, you know, before me, how many times I've read Wittgenstein and Kierkegaard and Hume and Kant and you know, that whole history of philosophy and philosophers of other cultures, and just how much thought and how much distillation it has taken. It's like I'm still getting new thoughts for the last, like, 5 or 6 years, 7 years. Every day when I was writing that book on convergence theory, I would get a major set of results that clarified like everything I'd been doing previously. And that happened every day for about 7 years. So it's hard to achieve a certain level of clarity. It's hard, for example, I find, to distill existentialism to the understanding that you cannot leave the world to view it. That's a very simple statement. It's not something that seems to be understood. I've talked to professors of existentialism. They haven't understood it. When I've explained it to them, they understand it, but they're not quite clear on it. they haven't fully distilled it. When I explain to people that the solution to the world, the inability to do a controlled experiment, is the asymmetry, or the fact that it's different in different directions. I don't hear people talking about the significance of the world being different in different directions. So it's taken, and I don't see people understanding or representing philosophy as the limit of rigor. When that's all it is. So, so in other words, I feel that there's a lot of confusion within the subject. And then with confusion in the subject, there's also been the inability to apply it outside the subject. When I wrote my first philosophical work, I said to myself, okay, nobody cares about philosophy. Nobody really understands it. Let's make an application. And the application I made, and we'll talk about this more, and it's in the play, it's discussed in the play, was to cancer, was to the molecular biology of what could serve as a potential cancer chemotherapeutic agent, a potential cancer cure, what form that could take. And that result was a set of viruses, mutated viruses, that came out of the philosophy that I gave out at places like UCLA, where the result was eventually developed, and it now has become a major field of cancer therapy and treatment. So that's an application of philosophy that's only been possible because of achieving a certain distillation, a certain clarity of philosophical results that I don't find that common. Okay, but it's something I have gone out of my way to do, and it's in the play, and it's one of the reasons why I'm giving these talks, to make the power of the subject, in different directions more clear, because it is not clear.
And yeah, philosophy is actually more contributive to this world than most of people think.
It created science.
Yes. The last question for today is from Haidar Shah again. What it means to be in a certain state of mind?
Well, okay, now that's a hard question. Okay, notice when I see that question, one of the things that's problematic, let's say, one of the issues that the question raises is, we are in the state of mind, right? To characterize that state of mind is an attempt to characterize it from the outside. Okay, so we're asking for seeing ourselves, seeing our state of mind from the outside of that state of mind, which actually is seeing it from a different state of mind. The true answer to that question, and maybe I'll expand on this a little bit more next time. The true answer to that question is that within the pure state of mind that you're in, when you are in a given state of mind, is not characterizable. And that is what's distinctive about it. If you can characterize it, then you're not quite in it. But I think, should I maybe go on more next time with that answer?
I think we can continue it next time more broadly, more detailed.
Let me ask you, do we have some other questions? So I'll deal more with that at the beginning of next session. Are there any other questions that we might want to know?
There are no questions. There are a lot of comments, but no questions. Yeah. So we can.
Okay, so let me use that as a springboard for next time. Okay, the question of characterization of a state of mind.
So thank you very much for this interesting and very useful and practical session. I hope our viewers and participants learn a lot as well. And thanks to all for all your questions. They were very interesting, and we also, as Mr. Steven Friedman mentioned during his speech, when we are tutoring or when we are answering, we are learning as well. So it's also the learning process for us. And we hope to see you next week, next Friday, the same time. Please stay tuned and prepare your questions in advance so we can also be prepared and answer them quickly. Have a great weekend, everyone. Goodbye. See you.
Thank you very much. See you next week. Bye-bye.